Chapter 34. The four of them took it slow. Carb's steps were confident but measured. Callie knew her squadmate was waiting for reality to bend and jumble itself again. Shit, they all were. Callie kept waiting for her suit lights to stop penetrating the darkness, for the suffocating sense of doom of being swallowed alive by the ship. Each step drove a spike of fear into her stomach, and to make matters worse, no one was talking. Ever since they'd taken the fork, even the occasional breath over the comms had ceased coming through. It was as if the entire squad held their collective breath, or, more likely, everyone had muted their mic like Callie had. While Dickerson had scouted the corridor, she and Carb had checked over Elliot's suit, made sure their O2 supplies were filled, and checked for suit damage. Elliot's civvy suit had so far held up. She and Carb's suits, on the other hand, had damage to both their armor and the underlying reinforced fabric. If they ever made it back to S&R Black, Callie imagined none of her squad suits would pass inspection. They'd be thrown into the recyclers, never to be seen again.
"Hatch coming up,"
Carb said. The sound of Carb's voice startled her, and she nearly lost her balance. "Copy," Callie said. "Elliot, how you doing?"
"Good, Corporal,"
the wounded Marine said.
"Breathing easier. That's because your lungs aren't cramped up. If we had some real gravity, you'd probably have no problem at all." "Gravity?"
Carb said.
"What I wouldn't give for some damn gravity." "Funny, ain't it?"
Dickerson said.
"We're surrounded by grav plates everywhere we go, but we can't power them. I wish I'd seen Mira before she went to shit."
Callie found herself nodding. Despite the horrors lurking on the ship, possibly even hunting them down, she had to admit that Mira had been a magnificent ship. The design, the cutting-edge technology developed that was still being used across the Sol Federation, not to mention the sense of optimism Mira had spread throughout humankind, made her the pinnacle of human achievement. And now look at her. 1 billion metric tons of Atmos steel, plasteel, transparent aluminum, and void knew what else tumbling through space with a dangerous payload, one that could spell the end for humankind. The Hollows said Mira Day had been a Sol Federation-wide holiday, with parties thrown everywhere in the system. All of humanity watched as the ship cleared its moorings from Trident Station and began its journey to the outer Kuiper Belt. Hollow channels ran around the proverbial clock, providing views from Mira's external cameras, feeds from passing probes, and the ship's telescopes. The crew recorded themselves countless times, with updates of life on the ship, the daily grind of maintaining so large a ship, and their hopes and dreams. And humanity swallowed it all, for years. The further Mira retreated from Pluto, the longer the transmissions took to reach habitable space. Before Mira sent her final transmission, the large ship was more than a light year away from Sol, and still accelerating. But that had been bullshit, hadn't it? Mira had survived after the supposed last transmission date. She'd been somewhere beyond the solar system, exploring for minerals with no intention of ever reaching Proxima Centauri b. Instead of performing the mission humanity was sold, she'd been doing nothing more than finding new resources closer to Sol. Captain Kovacs had mentioned there were 9 dwarf planets in addition to the one they'd explored. 9 new planets. 8 XJ had held the beacon. What did the other 8 contain? Other beacons? More life forms? Or were they simply lifeless hulks floating beyond the edge of the solar system? Callie shivered. Mira, the promise for humanity's salvation, a symbol of hope for the species, was now little more than a plague ship heading back to her creators. To infect, to destroy. Quit it, she told herself. It's nothing more than an ancient derelict that brought back a few friends. We just need to get the beacon, shut it off, and this nightmare will be over. She hoped. Carb reached the hatch and peered through the transparent aluminum housing.
"Yup,"
she said.
"It's another airlock."
"Good," Callie said, commenting more about the thoughts that crumbled in her mind. "Grabbing your feed." Carb's helmet cam feed lit up on Callie's HUD. Callie minimized the other views and focused. The hatch fronted a containment tunnel that led to yet another hatch before providing an ingress into the room. The suit lights easily penetrated the gloom and into the room beyond through the inset windows. It was difficult to make out most of the shapes against the far wall, but Kelly was fairly sure there were lab stations, including large analysis modules probably for ore specimens. Or, she thought, for exosolar material.
Looks clear,
Carb said.
What do you think, boss?
Was there a point to walking in there? If they only found more O2 stations and perhaps an emergency generator, was it worth the time? They had a safe area for the other corridor, but not for this one. She sighed. I think we go in,
Corporal,
Dickerson said.
we're pretty much out of fuel for the beam cutters. How are we going to open it?
Kelly ground her teeth as she stared at the feed. He was right. The remaining fuel they had would allow them ingress to the room, maybe, but then they'd be done. If they needed the cutter to get through another area of the ship, they'd be fucked. Unless, of course, they used explosives. The only problem with using explosives to open doors is that they wouldn't close again. It would be impossible to create a safe room if they had to smash through its walls or doors. No way to pressurize. No way to capture heat. No way to hide themselves behind thick bulkheads and transparent aluminum. She thought for a moment before sighing. Carb, check for a manual release on this side.
Aye, boss,
Carb said. Kelly checked her rear cam feed and saw Elliot standing less than 2 meters away, his helmet pointed at the deck. You doing okay, Elliot? His helmet popped upward as if in surprise.
Yeah, boss, I'm good. Just fell asleep for a second.
That wasn't good. She'd hoped a fresh load of nannies in his system would quickly help alleviate his concussion symptoms, as well as the shock. Those nannies were more than 50 years old, though. No telling how well they were functioning, much less what they were actually doing. Headache? She asked.
No?
Elliot said.
Well, not exactly. Just get the feeling of vertigo every now and then.
She nodded to herself. Yep, the nannies were either focused on another part of his body, or they were incapable of repairing the damage in his brain and nervous system. Void, but they needed rest. If they could just make it to the fucking escape pods, they could get out. Get back to black, to safety, to something resembling normalcy. Carb?
Nothing doing, boss. I don't see shit. No way in.
Kelly tightened her fingers on the rifle until a cramp shot pain up her wrist. Okay, fuck it, she said. Keep moving. Elliot, you ready?
Yeah, boss. Let's do this.
His voice hadn't sounded as confident as he'd probably hoped. She could tell him to be honest about his injuries, about whether or not he could continue, but she doubted he'd say a damned word about it unless he was on the verge of death. She grinned. If she were in his position, she'd probably do the same. It was one thing to know you were going to die, but it was another to know that your condition was putting your squad mates at risk. Together we stand, divided we fall, Kelly said to herself. If only the rest of humanity realized that. All right, Carb, lead on.
Aye, boss.
Carb slowly turned herself away from the hatch to face the darkened corridor, hesitating for a beat before resuming her crouch walk. Kelly waited until Carb was more than a meter away before following her lead. Back to the crouch walk. Great. Kelly's muscles complained, but complied. Another hour or two of this, and she didn't know if she'd be able to crawl, much less walk. The unlovely truth was that the longer you stayed in a cramped position, the more difficult it was to stretch out the muscles and joints when you left it. Eventually, their bodies would simply refuse to obey commands to stand, walk, or run. What then? Shut up, she said to herself. The escape pods. If they could just get to the fucking escape pods. Focus on that, nothing else. The hell with information. Get your squad out of this. Get yourself out of this. Kelly took a deep breath and released it in a long stream. They continued down the corridor, Kelly checking her rear cam feed every few steps to watch for signs of fatigue from Elliot. The injured Marine seemed to be walking fine, but every minute or so, she noticed him swaying a bit. Whether it was from the awkward civilian mag boots, fatigue, or damage to his spine, it was impossible to tell. Only Elliot knew for sure, and he wasn't talking about it. Kelly sent a block message to Dickerson, asking him to keep an eye on Elliot. The big Marine had responded with the image of a curled fist, a thumb raised high above the clenched fingers. Good. Dickerson could keep watch on Elliot better than she could.
Hey!
Carb called out.
I think there's another junction ahead.
Frowning, Kelly brought up the schematics. That can't be right. Squad, hold. She waited for affirmatives from Elliot and Dickerson before walking forward and taking position next to Carb. Their combined suit lights illuminated the wide bulkheads. Kelly saw what looked like an opening that adjoined the corridor some 10 meters ahead of them. That's not on the map, Kelly said. Nothing like that at all. Dickerson groaned.
Those fucking AIs, they screw us again.
Don't know, Kelly said. Carb, cover me.
Aye, boss.
She kept her eyes focused on the so-called junction facing the adjoining hallway. With each step, the unmapped dark area became a little more clear. The frown on her face slowly turned into a wide O of surprise. It wasn't another hallway. It was a tear in the bulkhead. Something had destroyed the atmos steel wall shielding the corridor from the rest of the ship. Shit, Kelly said.
Corporal?
Dickerson asked.
What the hell is that? Somebody blew the corridor up?
Squad, move up, Kelly said. Looks like the bulkhead blew out. Except that's not what it looked like at all. If the corridor wall had been blown out by explosive decompression, the fringes around the open wound wouldn't be so jagged and torn. It obviously hadn't been destroyed by explosives either. Atmos steel would have puckered from the force of an explosion, the remaining material blown outward. Instead, the bulkhead had been torn and shredded, petals of jagged metal pointing into the corridor as well as toward the area beyond. Kelly waited in silence as Carb took position less than a meter behind her, Elliot and Dickerson lurking little more than 2 meters away. Once they were close enough, she held up a fist and continued walking. The closer she approached, the more details she could see. Her lights reflected off the savaged atmos steel, the broken layers shining dully back at her. Roughly 4 meters in diameter, the hole started at the base of the deck and rose more than halfway up the bulkhead. Whatever had done this had been big. Damned big. Each step toward the hole increased the buzzing sensation in her stomach and the tingles of fear washing over her skin. Her suit's illumination seemed to disappear into the gaping wound. Another shiver crawled down her spine, so powerful it nearly paralyzed her. Something was watching them. She was sure of it. Squad, she whispered over the comms. Get past me. Go further down the corridor. Go slow.
Aye, boss.
Carb said.
Corporal?
Dickerson asked.
Something wrong?
Don't ask questions, she hissed. Just get past me. Dickerson, once you're past the perforation, put your claymore down.
Aye, Corporal,
Dickerson said. He sounded concerned, even a little afraid. Well, of course he does. She hadn't been able to keep the fear out of her voice, and no matter how hard she tried, she didn't think it was even possible. Staring into the impenetrable darkness made her feel as though she were falling into it. A darkness deeper than space without even the twinkle of distant stars staring back at her, through her. It was watching them, and she didn't want to know what it was.
Placed,
Dickerson said. Kelly snapped her eyes to her HUD. With the exception of Dickerson, the squad had already passed her. She blinked in confusion. How had they gotten by her without her noticing? The darkness yawned a little wider.
Corporal, you hear me?
Dickerson's voice sounded far away, as though he were shouting down a tunnel. There were other sounds, other voices, but they turned into an incomprehensible jumble of syllables, demented whispers from another universe. She nearly screamed when something grabbed her shoulder. Her body shot upright from the crouch, and she swiveled toward the threat, finger gently pulling on the trigger. Dickerson's helmet pointed at hers, his hands and rifle pointed at the ceiling.
Whoa, Corporal, it's just me.
She ground her teeth. She'd almost shot him. Yeah, she said. Sorry.
You okay?
She switched to private comms and pointed at the hole. You see anything?
No.
Dickerson said.
It's like there's nothing there, but...
He said, his voice trailing off for a moment.
Something's there. I can feel it.
She nodded to herself, wondering if he felt the same spine-crawling tingles washing across her nerve endings. All the saliva in her mouth dried up. She tried to speak, but the sound was little more than a croak. After biting the inside of her mouth, she managed to get a little moisture rolling on her tongue. She cleared her throat and tried again. Let's get out of here.
Copy that,
Dickerson said.
You first. I'll cover.
He stepped to the side, his rifle pointed to the side of the tear in the bulkhead. She said nothing, but moved past him at a quick pace. Once she traveled a meter, she turned and again faced the opening. Clear and covering, Kelly said. Dickerson walked backward away from the darkness. After he'd cleared Kelly's sightline, he changed direction and continued walking backward down the corridor. Somewhere back there, Carb and Elliot waited for them. Lucky them. They hadn't stared into the abyss and felt it staring back with something akin to malevolent hunger.
You're clear, Corporal.
She checked her rear cam. He had moved 3 meters back from her, holding his rifle with a tight angle on the far side of the mouth's opening. Kelly choked back her gorge, turned, and walked as fast as she could.
We, leaving the Claymore?
He asked. Yes, Kelly said. She quickened her pace until she moved past him, feeling as though phantom teeth snapped at her back. She turned and faced the area again. Clear. Keep retreating. We'll stagger, she said.
Copy,
Dickerson said. She couldn't decide if his responses were so clipped because he was focused or he was as afraid as she was. When they finally caught up to Carb and Elliot, the sensation had dampened. Whatever had been staring at them from the void, its presence had receded. Whether from their distance or because it had departed, she didn't know. She hoped it was still there, staying put, locked in some prison of its own making and unable to follow them. Then again, hadn't the darkness swallowed their lights at the junction behind them? Hadn't a wall seemed to follow them?
What was it?
Carb asked.
Not sure,
Dickerson said.
Did you feel it when you walked by? Sure as hell felt something.
Elliot said.
Thought I was going to shit myself.
A moment of silence lingered over the comms, as if her squad mates wanted to agree, but couldn't bring themselves to. Okay, Marines, we're going to take the same positions and keep moving. Kelly checked the schematics. Another 40 meters and we'll exit the science section.
Not sure which is worse, boss. Being trapped in here knowing something nasty is behind us, or walking into another unexplored area.
Kelly knew how she felt. At least here, they knew where to retreat. The corridors were easily defensible, having only to worry about threats from behind or in front of them. Unless they found another artificial junction, they were safe behind the meters of Atmos steel making up the bulkheads. She hoped. Carb began leading again, her steps methodical but faster than before. Kelly wanted to tell her to slow down, to take her time, but couldn't help the feeling that the faster they moved, the better. Their O2 reserves were still in the green, but she wanted out of the science section. Something was in here with them, maybe several somethings. She brought up Dickerson's rear cam feed and added it to her HUD. The pair of lights pointing behind them illuminated a full 7 or 8 meters. Good. The darkness hadn't yet found them. Or maybe it was trapped in that first junction, the real junction, near the science section entrance point they'd first come through. Kelly flicked her eyes to the bulkheads in front of them. Nothing. No signs of damage, no debris. The science section, with its large rooms secured behind 2 hatches, was the cleanest, most pristine part of Mira they'd explored. And why was that exactly? Why hadn't the hatches been blown open? Why weren't the hallways filled with the frozen corpses of scientists and support personnel? Where had they gone? Even after Mira was catastrophically damaged, she had a difficult time believing the science section had simply been shut down. It seemed like an area easily secured, pressurized, and powered. As they approached another hatch, Carb held up a fist and the squad halted. She took another 2 steps forward and turned her head to the hatch.
Shit,
She said.
boss, this one's open.
Open?
Yeah,
Carb said.
as in the goddamned outer hatch is missing. So is the inner one.
Kelly maximized Carb's cam feed. The Lance Corporal hadn't been kidding. The hatch hinges were little more than torn and ripped jags of metal. Dense and cracked spiderwebbed the airlock tunnel, as if something large had struggled to get inside, bowing out the steel in the process.
Go in?
Carb asked. Good question, Kelly thought. Something had ripped through the hatches. Why? And more importantly, was there maybe something in there that they needed to see?
We can't seal the room,
Dickerson said.
so it's not much good to us as a redoubt. Might have O2.
Carb said.
Shit, it might have a functional terminal.
Kelly ground her teeth. God, she was tired. She could think more clearly if fatigue wasn't settling into every fiber of her being. Stimulants weren't going to help that. The stim crash she and her squad would ultimately experience was going to be epic as it was. Dickerson sighed over the comms.
Might also have the fucking boogeyman.
Kelly chuckled in spite of herself. Our 6 is clear, nothing in front, and our lights are actually splitting the darkness. Might want to take a peek,
Yeah,
Elliot said.
not like we're ever coming back here. Might as well see the sights. Oh, hush, luggage.
Carb said.
Adults are talking. Fuck off.
Elliot said with a yawn.
Besides, I'm not luggage anymore.
For now, Carb said. All right, Kelly said. Knock it off. She stared into the darkness. That feeling of being watched, as though something was in there, something waiting for them, crawled over her skin. A tired grin spread across her face. It wasn't just this room, she thought. Every nook and cranny in the entire void-forsaken ship felt as though it was watching them, waiting for them to drop their guard, just waiting as if it had been waiting for nearly half a century for them to arrive, for someone to arrive. Carb, your turn to explore. I'll go with you. Dickerson groaned.
Forgive me, Corporal, but I think we need you out here with Elliot, just in case.
Just in case. She knew what Dickerson meant. Kelly had the most rescue training, the most medical training, and furthermore, she was in charge. Since Elliot was no longer clamped to Carb's shoulder and walking on his own, there was no longer an excuse for her to take point. She knew all of that, and yet she still wanted to walk through the short tunnel and see what was in the room. The pull was palpable, almost physical. Okay, Carb, you and Dickerson take the room. I want full cam feeds and take it slow.
Aye, boss,
Carb said. She walked further into the tunnel entrance to give Dickerson some room.
All right, big boy, take my 6. Ah,
Dickerson said. Kelly stepped back to make more space and walked backward until she had a view of both ends of the corridor, Elliot and the room's entrance. Slow and careful, she said. Carb said something that might have been, Yes, Mom, but Kelly wasn't sure.